Welcome on back to History 1302. This is Professor Tatum with yet another lecture. But let's not get too excited because here we're looking at the nation depressed. All right. We're looking here at the Great Depression. And as we move through this lecture, I'd like us to be considering why we refer to this as a depression. Earlier points of economic hardship in the US were referred to as panics. Why I call this one a depression? And as you consider this, I'd like you to think beyond economics. Okay, I'm sure you could Google the difference in a depression versus a recession versus a panic. That's not what I'm concerned with. Why are we using that particular word depression here? If you're looking at a little context as usual, here we'll be examining causes of the Great Depression. Then we'll also look at how the Great Depression impacted people from different walks of life in the United States. And then we'll look at how people began seeking help to overcome the pressures and struggles of the Great Depression. And we'll see how that turned out for them. So, the causes of the Great Depression, I will suggest, as usual, there is no single cause, right? There's not just point A and point B. It's much more complicated than just black and white. History is never that simple. We need to embrace that complexity. But one major cause was the fact that there was an unstable global economy after World War One. So, for example, the Allied powers, primarily Britain and France, owed the U.S. a lot of money that they had borrowed during the war. And when the Allies found themselves short on funds, they would turn to Germany and Austria. Because we need to understand that the Central Powers, like Germany and Austria, under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended World War One, were required to pay reparations to the Allied powers for their role in the war. Problem was, Germany and Austria were suffering from their own economic hardships, and they frequently found it difficult to pay the Allied powers the money they owed them. And the US kind of looked at this situation and they said, well, if Germany and Austria are unable to pay countries like Britain and France back, well, then Britain and France can't pay us back the money they owe us, and they're going to run out of business. And they're some of our best business partners. So we'll do what we got to do here. And the US wound up loaning money to these former Central Power nations just so that they could pay their reparations to the Allies, and the Allies could in turn keep paying the US what they owed them. But basically, think about that like this: think if somebody owes you money, they're counting on somebody else to pay them money. So you take $1 out of your own pocket to give to this guy so that he can give this guy your money back. Doesn't make much sense, does it? And we really need to understand also that if any of these countries have something come up at any step of the way where they're unable to make the payment to the other, everybody's screwed, okay? Because then there's no money in circulation. And that's kind of what happened here at the start of the Great Depression. Another major factor at play that led to the Great Depression was that extensive buying on the margin, meaning buying on credit, that we saw throughout the Great Depression. People not only were buying products on installment buying, but people were also buying stocks on credit, using the stock market as a means to get rich quick. People would take loans out from banks and then put that money towards stocks, hoping to get an investment back because the stock market was booming during the boom, the roar of the 1920s, right? And banks were kind of giving out loans for this left and right because it was so profitable. Well, we'll see how that turns out. Another major cause was the stock market crash. The stock market crash frequently gets cited as the major reason, the key reason, but it's really more a reflection of all these other things at play than it is the sole cause. It did, however, result in a sense of panic that led to other economic failings. Okay, so what happened here was the Federal Reserve. Remember, we've looked at the Federal Reserve before. That's the organization that kind of helps regulate the money supply, helps regulate banks, acts as a bank for other banks by loaning them money. Well, they kind of issued a warning out to banks around the country and said, look, we see you guys giving out all these loans left and right so that people can go and buy stocks. Maybe slow down a little bit on how much money you're giving out to people to go buying stocks. All right, because we know the stock market ebbs and flows. In it, we have booms and busts. We have good times and bad times in the economy. That's kind of how economics work. So maybe slow down with how much you're giving out because this really could become problematic if you loan too much out too easily. And when the public learned that the Federal Reserve had issued this warning, people began to panic. And when people began to panic, a lot of people started selling their stocks left and right. And if there's too many people buying all the stocks one day and then selling them all the next day, that's going to lead to some serious problems. And sure enough, the market began to crash. And when the market began to crash, the US turned to some tactics they had used in previous times of economic hardship, and they turned to some wealthy investors. So, for example, they turned to JP Morgan and Company, and they asked, please help us out. Give us some money to help stabilize the economy. Go throw some money around, do what you got to do, save us. So a bunch of wealthy investors, including a bunch of investors in JP Morgan and Company, did come together, start throwing their money in the right directions, helped kind of restore the economy a bit. That only worked for a few days. This was a much more severe economic panic, and definitely a much more severe stock market crash than the US had ever seen up to this point. So within a matter of days, by a day known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crash saw a climax. And on this day, stock values just plummeted. And a lot of people lost tremendous investments that they placed into the stock market. Okay, a lot of people had put their entire life savings into the stock market. Remember, other people were taking out loans from the bank, borrowing money they could not afford to pay back unless those stocks did well. Well, guess what? Now the market crashed and they're screwed. Unfortunately, in response to this massive loss, there were several people throughout the country who committed suicide. Very, very devastating. Other people took further actions that would continue to hurt the economy. And that's linked very closely to bank failures, which began to occur as a result of the stock market crash. All right, so we need to remember the purpose of a bank is not to store money, they only hold a little bit of money at a time, right? Their primary purpose is to loan money. They're a business that loans money and makes a profit off of those interest payments they get from those loans they give out. And when the stock market crashed, remember, all these banks had been loaning out money for stock speculation. And once the market crashed, they realized they were not going to be getting any payments back for all those loans they'd been given out. So that led to some banks to start to collapse. And as banks started to collapse, we need to understand that in this period, there was no bank insurance. So if a bank closed down, your money was gone for good. You're SOL. From here, people responded with what were called bank runs. That refers to this mass flocking of people to banks to pull out all their money and a sense of panic. But if people were pulling all their money out of banks, that's going to screw those banks even more. And that led to further bank collapses throughout the country. And in turn, that's going to lead to further economic hardships. All right. So consider, for example, if all these banks are failing and businesses depend on those banks for loans to function, and now these businesses can no longer get loans from the banks. Well, now those businesses are finding themselves in a tough spot. And in most cases, when businesses find themselves in a tough spot and they need to save some money, the first way they're going to do that is by laying people off. All right. So this also led to massive unemployment. All these hard times here are very much intensified by people acting out of fear and out of panic. So it's very rational at a time like this, when there's this big national catastrophe, to have really, this is a global issue. We're focusing on the U.S. here since it's the U.S. history course, but this is going to impact the whole world. Well, that's a very rational time, I'd say, to have a sense of, I need to do something here. Your body's going to start sending off alarms saying you need to respond. That's all very, very normal and very rational. What's not rational is allowing that panic to take over and going and pulling all the money out of the bank, right? Or if we look at an example from more recent history, if there's a global pandemic, it is perfectly rational to think, well, here I do need to take some kind of action, right? I need to do something to protect myself, protect my home, protect my family. That's all perfectly understandable. What's not rational is to go pulling all the toilet paper out the shelves, leaving the rest of us suffering, struggling to try to wipe our shoes. Excuse me. So let this be a lesson to us here. Easier said than done, I know, but we need to learn as much as possible to take control of our emotions rather than allowing our emotions to control us. Okay. And when we're in these very difficult times where we see a lot of people around us panicking and taking all these very rapid actions, we kind of need to be the voice of reason to take a few breaths, as many as we need, to get to that state where we can kind of say, look, I'm going to take action here, but I'm going to take a reasonable, cautious action. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to rush to the bank to pull all my money out. I'm not going to rush to the store and pull all the toilet paper off the shelves. I'm going to take a rational action. All right. Again, easier said than done, but the more we can do that, the more we can avoid making problems worse than they are in so many cases. Okay, moving on. So, as the Great Depression started spreading throughout the country, there was a widespread sense of hopelessness that people were feeling. There was massive unemployment, leaving a lot of people struggling, and a lot of people had to go seeking support from local charities who were struggling to keep up with the demands. People were having to stand in lines for soup and bread, a little food to feed their families. And all these people, we need to understand, have had it kind of programmed in their head throughout their entire lives that you don't take anything for free, that Americans are people who earn everything they get. And we've always picked ourselves up by the bootstraps and earned everything for ourselves without any assistance. Now, as we've seen in earlier lectures, that's not 100% accurate. A lot of people who we give credit for being the tough, rugged individuals who picked themselves up by the bootstraps actually did have a lot of help, especially from government, right? But still, people had this idea that by asking for help, even in such a desperate time, there was something wrong with that. And I understand where they're coming from. Sure, there's a sense of earning what's yours and not being dependent on others, or not placing a burden on others by having them have to give to you in order for you to be able to care for yourself. But when you're in a situation like this, where there is not only a national but a global catastrophe, it's okay to seek a little help. Don't beat yourself up or anyone else up for that in a time like this, okay? This depression also had some long term impacts on individuals. Some individuals who developed hoarder type habits. So, for example, I lived with my grandma for some time, and also I saw this exact same habit play out with my next door neighbor who was a World War II veteran. They both grew up in the Great Depression, and both of them had this habit of collecting newspapers. Now, I'm not talking they had a few newspapers, they had in stacks of newspapers, okay? And my grandma, my lord, especially when she got in her older age and she was losing it a little bit, you tried throwing a newspaper away in front of her, you're going to lose your arm, all right? She was going to cut it off. And one day I asked her about this, and she explained to me that when she was a kid, she never knew when you might need that newspaper to start a fire, all right? Whether it's to keep warm or to save on having the lights on, anything like that, you might need that newspaper. Wow. That was just so impounded in her head from living through this experience. And I think that speaks for what a difficult time this was, that stuck with her and with this other individual, my next door neighbor as well, through the rest of both of their lives. And that's one example. All kinds of other little things, butter dishes, little crappy Tupperwares that you get with leftovers. Couldn't throw any of those away because you never knew when you might need them. Now I do some of these things to some extent. I think a lot of us do probably save the country crock butter tub and things like that every now and then. But if it's getting to a level where it's excessive because you think you might need it someday, that's a pretty clear sign that you've lived through some really heavy shit. All right. And I do want to emphasize as well that no matter how tough any of us who have the privilege of being in a college class have had it, I would be willing to bet that the struggles we've been through are not quite what people went through here in the Great Depression. Okay. There was no welfare, no food stamps, anything like that. They depended very heavily on private charities, but as I suggested, private charities, churches, organizations like that were really struggling to have enough supplies available for the intense demand that there was for their services during the Great Depression. All right, so let's break down what conditions were like for certain individuals and certain demographics. For this lecture activity, I want you guys to review a set of sources. You'll see I have a collection of sources available for you right after this lecture from a man, a woman, and a younger individual, a young man, during the Great Depression. And what I'd like you to do is keep these questions in mind, go read the sources, and respond to these in the lecture activity based on what you're reading there and what we've covered so far here. So you got to keep in mind the context of the Great Depression. These are sources written by individuals who lived through the Depression. Now, I will say it's not normally an accurate or adequate way to understand an entire time period by reading just a few sources like this, right, from few perspectives. But I've done enough study on this topic and I've carefully chosen the sources that I have because I know that they do reflect what a lot of individuals were experiencing in this period. So you should be able to get a pretty accurate idea of what the kind of standard American working family was experiencing during the Great Depression through these sources. But just for the sake of moving forward, if you want to study another historical topic on your own, don't think you can just pick out three random primary sources and say, okay, I read this person's experience and that person's experience. I get it now. It's a lot more complex than that. All right. So these are basically, I'm just trying to see that you're engaging with the sources. As long as it's clear to me you've taken the time to read the source and think about this, and you're not just throwing some random words down, you're going to get full credit. I just want you to engage with these sources and consider these things here. So go ahead and knock this out and then jump back on, and I'll go through each of these as well and kind of discuss my findings and how we can make sense of all of this to understand the experiences of these different demographics of Americans during the Great Depression. Okay, so of course, what we know about traditional roles of American women are essentially the women were expected to be caretakers of the home and of children. That's a social expectation that had been placed on women since even the colonial period, definitely by the early years of the United States being established as a nation. And the Great Depression has definitely complicated this, right? Because now many women are not only having to take up positions in work to help care for their families, but they're also struggling now to make ends meet around the house. They're struggling to come up with things like enough food. And they're very concerned for the well being of their home and their family. And the author in this source is focusing so much on food, talking about things like bean sandwiches and what she can do with a little bit of ground beef and all the things she can make stretch. And that seems to me to be almost defensive in a manner, to where she feels as if she needs to prove that, yes, despite these hardships, you see, I'm still being the best mother, the best wife I can be. I'm still being the best woman of the household I could possibly be, stretching all these things as much as I can to make sure that my family, especially my children, get to eat. All right. And you can tell she feels very guilty about not being able to provide as much as she would like for her kids, right? She wants to give them the best they have. And she talks about how they never really complain, but it just kind of kills her to not be able to give them as much as she'd like. And then with her husband, oh boy, her husband seems very kind of worried about conditions, and she's kind of having to also take on this other role of consoling him and letting him know, hey, it's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. We'll figure out a way. We still got to make sure the kids are having the best they can have. That's not something we can really afford to budget on. But still, despite doing that, we're going to figure this out and we're going to get through this. And that's a lot for a person to have to do when they're struggling on their own ends. She kind of holds this all together the best she can. And you may notice at the end of this source, she brings in the man cold. She talks about how if a woman is sick, she just has to kind of deal with it. Whereas if a man is sick, everyone within hearing distance is going to know. Well, she clearly has never seen my wife sick, or she would not be making such comments. But regardless, I just think that's hilarious that that the man cold's there. But seriously, we can see that she is taking on this whole new dynamic of providing a sense of care for her husband in a new way as well, as a result of the Great Depression. That adds just one extra level of burden to all these things that so many women throughout the country are already having to deal with. Okay, and I want us to think of these sources as we look at them not as the experiences of just the individuals we're reading about. Again, the whole goal here is to see how these represent how different demographics of people were experiencing the Great Depression. In terms of men, we know that the traditional role of men in the American home by the 1930s was essentially to be the breadwinner, the provider for the home. And for some of us in the 21st century, this all may require a little empathy, not sympathy. I understand dividing up homes and these traditional dynamics. Some of us may have grown up in different types of homes or may be hoping to develop different types of households on our own that have different dynamics than this, and that's totally fine. But we need to understand that this is the kind of traditional dynamic that most working class Americans were living in during the Great Depression, and this definitely impacted the social expectations that they felt were placed on them within that role in the home. Okay, and a lot of these men felt as if they've been kind of told their whole lives that they have this responsibility to care for their home and care for their family and to be the provider, and that if they are not able to do so at any point, that they have somehow failed as a man. Okay, they have somehow failed the role in the home and in society at large. Um, and that had a huge impact on these men's morale. You can see the guy in this source is struggling so bad that his little girl is having to lend him money to have a little luxury in his life, right? A little something as simple as tobacco. And it just kills him to take that because his daughter and his wife are working and he's not. There's something there we definitely need to understand as well with that. Uh, Men were frequently the first laid off because women and children, remember, were being paid less, which really exploits the justification behind that, which was, of course, this idea that in the stereotypical home, men are providing for their families, and any women and children who are working are just bringing a little extra home. Well, if you're laying men off in such large numbers, that doesn't really make any sense to expect for them to be providing for the home, now does it? All right, but regardless, women and children were still being paid less, so men being paid more were frequently the first laid off since they're requiring the biggest paychecks. But all this was definitely devastating on men's morale. It's making them feel as if they have failed in many cases, making them feel kind of a sense of worthlessness. Um, and we can also read through the between the lines in the source and see that this is impacting relationships as well. We saw that somewhat in the source from the woman. She seems a little irritated with her husband constantly being despondent. This man here as well talks about how this has caused trouble with his sexual relations with his wife, right? Like anytime he tries to make any kind of affectionate move toward her, he gets pushed away. And in both of these sources, we see that this is kind of really encompassing the man's life. He is so kind of consumed by this sense of failure and worthlessness as a result of these struggles that he's going through that it's difficult for him to do things like engaging with his family in a positive manner. All right. And I think that's something a lot of us can learn from, that if we're going through difficult times like this, again, this is something where it's a lot easier said than done. But when we're really struggling through hard times like this, we need to make sure that we're not allowing the situations we're going through to prevent us from still being present with the people around us. Okay, because that's just going to make the conditions far worse for the men in both of these sources. I think we can see that if they had allowed themselves to spend more positive time interacting with their wife and with their kids, a lot of their misery wouldn't be nearly as heavy. Now, that's not to suggest that they're not going through very real struggles. They absolutely are. It's just that's beyond their control, right? What's within their control is how they respond to it. Okay. One other thing think that we've seen so far within these first two sources is individuals taking on the burden of the Great Depression for themselves. All right. We need to remember this is a global phenomenon. Yet individuals feel as that they are in some way responsible for their unique experience. And maybe in some cases there is some of that to an extent. But if, for example, the men, as we've seen, are continuously looking for work, trying to work, going out doing what they can, there's no work there for them. That is beyond their control. Yet they're still feeling as if they have failed their family by not having that opportunity there, because that's been pounded into their heads that each person needs to take on all this responsibility. And God, that is just a lot to carry. Another thing you'll notice in this particular source is multiple times you'll see the word depression in there, and the times of the depression and things like that, and the impact of the depression. And you'll notice it's spelled with a lowercase d. All right. And when we're writing about the Great Depression, that's a title of a particular time period and a particular phenomenon. So we capitalize that D. All right. If we were talking about the Depression as the Great Depression, there would be a capital D. That's not what they're talking about through a good chunk of this source. They're talking about the fact that this man is depressed as a result of the economic hardships and all that they entail throughout this Great Depression. All right. And again, this is speaking for several men throughout the country and really around the world during this period. All right, this last one, the youth. Pretty heartbreaking. Straightforward, short. but shows us a lot of that same thing here. This poor individual here took on that responsibility so much that he felt as if he was a burden to his family, right? I think the answer to this first question here of why he decided to leave home is all in the title of the source. I was a burden. He felt as if he was a burden to his mother and his stepfather. That he was just an extra mouth to feed. He was just an extra expense. And whether or not that was directly communicated to him, or if he just kind of developed that sense based on how difficult he saw his family struggling, I'm sure there were some of both of those for young Americans around the country. And several young Americans around the country made the same decision as this young man and decided to leave home, go hit the open road in search of work and search of new lives. Okay. So this guy didn't take much with him. He took a few cents, he took some snacks, not a lot. I think if you're going to go hit the open road and you're starting a whole new life, wouldn't you want to take some things with you? I know when I go somewhere, I pack enough underwear to last me a lifetime just in case I shit my pants every day. Sometimes I do. Well, don't worry about that. But really, you think maybe he's going to take some toiletries? He's going to take more food than just a few little snacks, right? He's going to take stuff with him on the open road, no? Well, I think there's two very clear reasons for why he's taking what he's taking. One is he's out on the open road. He's got to be able to carry what he can wherever he goes. If he's jumping into trucks he's hitchhiking on, if he's got to hop a train, he's got to be able to take what he can with him. Number two, it's very likely that that's all he had. Okay. The little bit of change his mom gives him, that's probably all she had to spare. Another thing you'll notice is in this source, this young man went on his way out to charge a pack of cigarettes to a delinquent account, meaning an account that was already overdue on its payments. Okay. And number one, I know that's kind of weird for us to imagine a teenager in the 21st century going to buy a pack of cigarettes at the store, but in the 1930s, that wasn't very uncommon. But this young man goes and charges to this account that's already overdue on its payments to get this pack of cigarettes. And I think that kind of demonstrates that he's basically at this point kind of said YOLO. All right. It doesn't really matter at this point. I'm going to take this last little luxury with me to go and see what the hell the world has to offer out there. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be scary. But what do I got to lose? Right? There's nothing left to lose. And this also kind of shows that perhaps, maybe not even so consciously, but at a certain level, this young man has lost faith in the economic system. Okay. He's kind of not even concerned with keeping up with the payments. He says normally he'd be hesitant to charge on a delinquent account, but at this point, he just didn't care, right? He kind of probably not thinking this clearly in these terms, but it's kind of starting to formulate in his head that the system has failed and that there's no use to sit there trying to save nickels and dimes because he is already so screwed that he feels like there's no way of getting out of it. So we can see this Great Depression has had tremendous impacts on all members of the American family. I really wish we were doing this face to face. I really like doing this activity face to face. Students offer all kinds of excellent feedback. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to add in your lecture activities. Please make sure you go ahead and get those knocked out for credit. All right, so on that note of individuals leaving home and traveling the country in search of work, that was a pretty common phenomenon, not only for younger Americans, but for people of all ages throughout the Great Depression. There were communities of individuals who became known as hobos. These were people who would hop trains and ride from town to town in search of work, always having to look out for the railroad bulls trying to beat them up at the stations. And these people developed their own sense of community by creating their own kind of shared culture. So, for example, many hobos would communicate through things like graffiti. Different signs might mean, "Hey, this is not a safe town. Don't stop here. You're gonna get your kicked." Or it might mean, "This is a safe town. If you go a couple blocks over, you'll find a church that offers shelter, or maybe there's food somewhere in this town accessible to us." And then they have their own sort of music as well. I love good old fashioned folk hobo music. It's good stuff. I had a buddy who we would hang out and pass around a jug of wine. He'd play his guitar, and sometimes I'd play a bass, or I'd get some brushes and tap on either a snare drum or a paper plate or whatever was around. and we'd sing Woody Guthrie and all kinds of other good old fashioned American hobo songs, and it was just always good music. But problem these hobos had is they were going out in search of work, in search of new opportunities, right? Hoping that if they went to a different town, they could find better conditions. The problem was is there was no work around the country, right? And people were struggling through these same conditions all over the country. So this isn't something they could just hop on the train and get away from, because wherever they got off on, they were going to find the same circumstances. Things were particularly tough during the Great Depression for immigrants and for minorities. They were often the very first laid off. We've already talked about how men were usually laid off before women because they were paid more. But minorities, even though they were usually paid less, were usually the first laid off because they were seen, unfortunately, usually as less valuable workers. But in addition to that, Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants, particularly, faced a very specific form of discrimination through a program referred to as the Mexican repatriation. Repatriation, as we'll see here, is perhaps not the most accurate term because a lot of these individuals were actually U.S. citizens. Let's take a look here at this video and learn a little more about the Mexican repatriation and what all it entailed.
Good morning, Hank. It's Tuesday. Recently, I was researching Dorothea Lange's famous migrant mother photograph, and I learned something that was never covered in any of my U.S. history classes, which is that during the Great Depression, the United States deported at least 400,000 and possibly as many as 2 million Mexican Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens. This came to be known as the Mexican repatriation, although as scholars have pointed out, since many of the people involved had never lived in or even been to Mexico, it was more of a depatriation. Okay, a bit of historical context. In the mid-19th century, the United States took a bunch of land from Mexico, including all of California and Arizona, as a result of the Mexican-American War and the Gadsden Purchase, and the people who lived in those communities who had been Mexican citizens became U.S. citizens. Then, in the early 20th century, the violence and economic disruption of the Mexican Revolution led lots of people to seek refuge in the United States. Also, the border between the U.S. and Mexico wasn't formally regulated until 1917. Right, so it's 1930, the Great Depression is underway, unemployment is rising, as is anti-immigrant sentiment, and the administration of President Herbert Hoover is promising real jobs for real Americans. And Hoover's labor secretary believes that deportations will decrease unemployment, a line of thinking that has proven extraordinarily durable, even though it isn't true. Like, national economies are not some zero-sum game where removing people from the workforce creates jobs. In fact, a 2017 study about the Mexican repatriation found that the deportations either had no effect on unemployment or else made it slightly worse. By the way, links to sources in the doobly-doo. Also, I know contemporary conversations about U.S. immigration are highly polarized, but I think it's important to note that in the 30s, the push for deportations came from both what would today be considered the left and the right. Like, many labor unions called for deportations, for instance, but so did the conservative Hoover administration. Amid all of this, local municipalities began rounding up Mexicans or Americans of Mexican descent, or at times anyone judged to have brown skin. Police officers or other officials would surround parks or neighborhoods where Mexican Americans lived and then take people onto trucks and drive them to Mexico, or else drive them to train stations where chartered trains took them to Mexico. Now, these deportations took many forms. Some were caused by a mix of coercion and discrimination. Like, for instance, many cities passed laws saying that Mexican Americans couldn't work for city governments. The federal government also encouraged large private companies to fire their Mexican American workers, which many companies did. But there were also other strategies to force people out of the U.S. Like, for instance, some hospital patients were literally wheeled out of hospitals and put onto trucks and driven to Mexico. There were sometimes legal proceedings, and if you could prove citizenship, which many people couldn't because such documentation was uncommon at the time, you might be allowed to stay, but you also might not. It varied dramatically from city to city, and it was extremely chaotic. But in general, those threatened with deportation had almost no legal recourse, and as a result, at a minimum, hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens were deported to Mexico. The U.S. government has never apologized for the repatriation, and it's not even mentioned in most U.S. history textbooks. And this isn't like ancient history. There are lots of people alive today who lived through this. One of them, for instance, was a 5-year-old boy named Jose Lopez, who, despite being born in Detroit, was deported. In fact, when he got to Mexico, he was teased because he didn't speak Spanish. Jose Lopez's parents would go on to die in exile, as did one of his siblings, but he returned to the United States in 1944 Ecuador after trying to prove his citizenship for 14 years. He worked for his entire career at Ford Motor Company, became a homeowner and a dedicated volunteer in his community. All three of his kids went to college. One is now an attorney. But there is also no getting back everything that Lopez lost as a result of his unjust and illegal deportation. Lopez is American, and his story is an American story, and telling that story will never be unpatriotic. Hank, I'll see you on Friday.
So that was John Green, the host of Crash Course U.S. History, and he just covers that so well. He's an excellent historian. Crash Course U.S. History is a fantastic channel if you're trying to learn more about any particular topic in U.S. history. He does Crash Course World History and European History as well. I've even looked at those videos a few times, and they're all just fascinating, and he's great at what he does. But he summed up very well that this was a program in which many Mexican Americans, as well as U.S. citizens, were deported from the country to try to ease the pressures of the Great Depression, despite the fact that that's not how economics worked then, and that's not how economics work now. Just taking groups of people you don't like and forcing them out of the country is not going to improve the economy and just make unemployment or anything like that go away. Same thing is true about crime, all right? We've unfortunately seen some very similar circumstances occur more recently, and that's something we just need to be very wary of and understand that this has tremendous impacts on the people involved as well as their friends and family members. So what I'm going to show you next here is a clip from a film, a great film called My Family, or Mi Familia in Spanish. And it kind of follows a chunk of American history through the lens of a certain Mexican American family to try to demonstrate the Mexican American experience throughout this period of U.S. history. It's a great film, and while it's fictional, it does a great job depicting several true historical events. And one event that is depicted here is how this family is impacted by this Mexican repatriation. So let's go ahead and take a look at that here.
Then came the day everything changed, when my mother didn't come home from the market. It was the time of the Great Depression. I guess some politicians got it into their heads that the Mexicanos were responsible for the whole thing. I mean, they were taking up a lot of jobs. Jobs that were needed for what they call real Americans.
I have to get home to my children. Por favor, señor, please.
So La Migra made some big sweeps through the barrio, and they rounded up everyone they could.
I live here. No, I belong here, señor, por favor. Señor.
It didn't matter if you were a citizen like my mother. If you looked Mexicano, you were picked up and shipped out. She had just been out shopping. She wasn't allowed to come home. My father was never told. She was all alone and she was pregnant. All these things really happened. The year was 1933.
Lock up. Back! Okay, roll her out!
So you can see this had a very tremendous impact, not only on the individuals who were taken and shipped off to Mexico, many of whom, as John Green hinted at, had been living in this region before the territory they were living in was even part of the United States. But this also had a tremendous impact on their friends and family. As the narrator in the video suggested, his father was never told. And that was the case many times here during the Mexican repatriation. And people would just have family members disappear. If you've ever had anyone close to you go missing for any period of time, or even if you've had somebody very close to you ghost you and you're really just not sure what happened with them, you know there's a very unique sense of discomfort that comes with that. And the pit of your gut that can consume the rest of your body has your thoughts flying in every direction. You imagine every scenario possible because you really just have no clue. And that's the impact that this Mexican repatriation had on several individuals. And unfortunately, with these more recent similarities in the United States, there are several individuals going through these same types of situations again in the 21st century. Farmers were also facing their own struggles during the Great Depression, facing a great deal of debt and inflation. Many of them were still having to resort to things like sharecropping and tenant farming, especially as a lot of their property was being foreclosed on. And this was all made worse by an ecological tragedy known as the Great American Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl refers to a series of dust storms that swept through the plains, causing severe damage to the region. This was mainly caused by overplowing, largely as a result as people started moving out to this area over several decades, especially as a result of things like the Homestead Act after the Civil War. People did begin plowing up a lot of this land to turn the soil in order to farm. And as this grass was kind of overplowed, it created a very loose topsoil. So when big windstorms came sweeping through, it would blow up all the topsoil and send huge clouds of dust flying through the air. And these dust storms that were created as a result were so devastating that they could just damage property, kill pets, and even kill people. And you may be wondering, how does a little dirt kill animals and people and destroy property? Well, look at how much dust we're talking about here. I've heard people describe this who have been through dust storms while serving in the Middle East, who have described it as everything just goes kind of dark. And then, you have to find a place where you can safely breathe. Because one thing you need to keep in mind is if you're breathing in while all this is flying through, you're breathing in all that dust, all right? And that's largely what would kill people and animals, is they would die of what was referred to as dust pneumonia, where they would literally breathe in so much dust that it would fill up their lungs and they would suffocate. This said in some cases also bury animals, and I don't know for sure. I haven't seen evidence of this, but I wouldn't be shocked to find out that there are people who have been buried alive as well. And to escape these devastating storms, a great deal of people living in the plains ended up leaving the region and taking an exodus out to the west. A lot of them went to regions like California in search of better conditions. These people got commonly referred to as Okies, even though a great deal of them were not actually from Oklahoma. That's a bit of a misnomer, but regardless, a great deal of people did leave in search of better conditions. A lot of them found, though, that when they got to places like California, things weren't much better there, right? They saw kind of the same things that hobos did going from town to town, that the Great Depression was not just a regional thing, it was all across the country, and really all around most of the major countries of the world by this point. So while several people did flee the Dust Bowl and their stories were captured in media, largely probably not very accurately, several others chose to stay. And now I want us to consider, why would people want to stay through these catastrophic conditions? And what were conditions like for those who stayed? Keep those questions in mind here as we review this video here from the author of this book, The Worst Hard Time. This is a book written by an author named Timothy Egan. He actually wrote another book that I had brought up in the last lecture about the Second Ku Klux Klan. That's a later book he wrote. This one I've read, and this is a great read. And in this book, he kind of tells the story of the people who stayed here in the Dust Bowl. And he learned their story by going out to the plains and interviewing some of the final survivors of this catastrophic event. So let's look here and hear a bit about what Timothy Egan learned through the experience of these interviews and throughout his research while writing this book.
The dust storms that terrorized America's high plains in the darkest years of the Depression were like nothing ever seen before. The story of the survivors is told in the award-winning book, The Worst Hard Time. Earlier, I sat down with Timothy Egan, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Well, told through the eyes of those who survived it, The Worst Hard Time gives a glimpse into the untold story of the Dust Bowl. Winner of the 2006 National Book Award, the book chronicles the brutally punishing dust storms that ravaged the American high plains, forever changing them. Joining me now in our studio is the book's author, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author Timothy Egan. Well, as a reporter for the New York Times, you cover a variety of issues. What first attracted you to this story?
It's a great question because this is the last story I expected to write. I mean, I live in the Pacific Northwest. I work for a New York paper. But we were working on a series about the death of the small towns in the western side of the Great Plains. All these little cities, these little towns that used to service farmers. Now remember, we used to be a nation of farmers. As late as 1930, 1 in 3 people worked the land. But now it's less than 1%. So all these little towns are dying. And I was going through just all over the plains, western part of the plains, going to little towns where the school was closing, the bank was closing. There were towns full of old people living on Social Security. And I was chronicling this story, and they would say, you know, the bigger story is what happened in the 1930s. And I'd say, what do you mean? They say the Dust Bowl. I said, well, that was Steinbeck. That was the Grapes of Wrath. Didn't everyone leave? No. It turns out everyone did not leave. It turns out 2/3 of the people living in the epicenter of the Dust Bowl stayed behind. And so that was the genesis, really, of this story, was this sort of holy cow moment, like, my God, maybe there's a big story here. And also, these people are dying. They're in their 80s and their 90s, and they have an amazing story to tell. And so I felt a sense of urgency, too, once I realized there was this story there, but this sense of urgency to get their story, to be sort of the bridge from them to other generations.
Now, while Steinbeck did tell the story of the people that did leave, why do you believe that 2/3, why do you believe they stayed on the land?
You know, a lot of people said at the time that they were stupid, they were ignorant, they blasted them, they criticized them, they made fun of their ancestry. I think it was a couple of things. They'd heard from other people that the diaspora wasn't working, that going to California, you couldn't do well. Also, they had something, Rob, they had something. They had a piece of dirt, which they'd never had before. And so, they thought it was going to end. They thought this can't possibly go on. So, and they thought, you know, when you're in the middle of a disaster like this, you don't think it's going to last 10 years. You think, you know, this is it. This is going to be the end of it. So they thought, if we just hold on, this thing will phase out.
And I believe that's what your book does so well, is it really paints a picture of the magnitude of this disaster.
I didn't realize until I started researching this how huge it was. It involved parts of 5 states, although the epicenter was the Oklahoma Panhandle, then at one point called No Man's Land, and the Texas Panhandle. But consider this, an area about the size of the state of Pennsylvania, more than 100 million acres, was completely blown away. The topsoil was completely blown off. It was soil that the government at that point considered largely useless. So just imagine a huge swath of the American fabric, just its ancient topsoil just ripped and thrown to the sky. Plus, consider this, one of the storms alone, Black Sunday, which was April 14th, 1935, sent more dirt to the air. This blew all the way to the East Coast too, by the way, and out to the ships at sea in the Atlantic. Just sent more dirt to the air than was displaced to build the Panama Canal over the entire 7 years that they constructed the Panama Canal. That's how much just pure dirt was thrown to the sky in one storm.
Quite adept at painting a verbal picture of not just the land, but also of the people that endured.
I came away so impressed by these people, and so much in awe of them, and so much in realization of how easy our lives are, my life is. I mean, my kids say, Dad, our cable's down. You know, compared to these people who starved, there was no Social Security, there were no farm price supports, there were no food stamps. At one point, you know, they would brine tumbleweeds. They started feeding it to their animals, and they themselves would eat it. They would slaughter a hog. They would just be one pig, and they'd slaughter a hog. And I heard this time and time again. They'd say, we ate everything but the squeal. You know, it was so different from our age, and yet still connected to our age.
Powerful, powerful images. Images that have really impacted our state. But this book has been on the national bestseller list for several months. Are you surprised by its success?
I really am, because, you know, when I finished this, I turned to my wife and I said, you know, I think I've written an honest book. I think I've written a good history. I think I've told their story. But who's going to want to read this? You know, people sometimes say that Americans don't care about history, that we live in the surface, we live in the present tense, we live on, you know, Anna Nicole Smith and all of that. But the response to this book, it's sold nearly 500,000 copies already, has told me and other people who write these kinds of books, Americans crave history. We need to know our story. We want to know why we came to a certain place and what came before us. So tell history well, and I think people will respond.
So does it make you feel good about us as a democracy that this has received the reception it has?
Even though this happened in your state, this is part of our story as Americans. This is part of our shared story. And we're like a family. We want to know what happened to the other kids. We want to know what happened to those people who came before us. You can't live a family or you can't live as a country if you don't have a shared narrative. So it does make me optimistic that people are embracing this narrative. A really awful time to put into context the good times that we've had. A really awful time to put into context that maybe this really was the greatest story of the greatest generation.
Well, a fantastic book about a terrible time and just a fascinating work.
Pleasure to be on. Thank you so much.
Thank you for visiting with us. To hear an excerpt from Egan's award-winning book, just head to our website at okhorizon.com and click on Value Added.
So definitely some tremendous struggles for people in agricultural areas throughout the Great Depression as well. And I think Timothy Egan has a point in this interview that, as one of my mentors used to like to say, these are the good old days, okay? Meaning that, sure, people like to complain about these days, nowadays, things are so bad. You can't trust people these days. Can't let your kids outside these days. As if there was a time that was so much better than the time we live in now. And really, if we look through the past, pretty much every time before the present moment's just as bad, if not worse. You know, we got AC, we got technology, which comes with its own problems. Don't get me wrong. I can lose my mind over the unnecessary complexity of technology sometimes. Yet we have all kinds of opportunities right here at our fingertips. Any information we want is just about accessible to us in one form or another. We can communicate with people around the world. This phenomenal the time we're living in. Not to say we do not have our share of problems, our share of hardships, our share of very kind of disturbing repetitions of patterns and cycles and rhymes that have been repeated throughout history, still occurring in the present day. But there's a lot that we can be grateful for in the present day. Okay, moving on. So we've seen people from all different walks of life struggle through this Great Depression. The only people who really were not impacted too bad by the Great Depression were the wealthiest of the wealthy. Maybe they had to give up a little something here and there, but not enough that it really let them see the true impact of the Great Depression. And we see a clear example of that with President Herbert Hoover. Okay, so as a bunch of people were struggling, many Americans did begin seeking help from the federal government. And the president during the start of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, gets a lot of pushback for not doing enough to help resolve the Great Depression. It seems that Hoover didn't so much have bad intentions. It's not that he didn't care about resolving the Great Depression. It's just that he was so caught up in his own little world of wealth that he underestimated what it really meant for people all around the country. Okay. So Hoover instead suggested that there's other institutions besides the federal government who should be responsible for helping ease people's pressure of the Great Depression. He said, go turn to state and local charities, go to churches. Well, as we recall, people were doing that, and those churches and charities were really struggling to meet the high demands of people in need during the Great Depression. Then he said, okay, well, then turn to state and local governments if necessary. Again, people were turning to their state and local governments for support. The state and local government said, this is a much bigger problem than anything we can really address. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll take care of big business, and business will take care of the economy. And we need to understand that this was unsuccessful here, and it's been unsuccessful since for a very obvious reason, okay? We refer to this, by the way, as trickle-down economics. And this is this idea that if you take care of business, if you take care of those at the top, they will take care of the rest of the economy, right? They're the ones who provide the jobs, they provide the services, and as they provide jobs, they'll put people to work, and then that'll get money flowing out into the economy, that'll have people working, etc. But remember, the goal of a business, the purpose of a business is to make a profit, okay? So if a business can manage to make more profit by continuing to operate with less workers, they're absolutely going to do that. If a business can find ways to replace workers with machinery, or to replace, as we saw during the Gilded Age, largely skilled workers with unskilled workers by dividing up tasks into very simple parts, they're going to do that. All right. So just taking care of business isn't necessarily going to do anything to help, say, employment. This didn't really resolve the problem. And again, I don't think Hoover had any bad intentions. I don't think he was an evil, money grubbing villain or anything like that. I think he just was clueless. All right. Like more recent people in politics in the United States, he had no frame of reference for what common people live like. Okay. He was too caught up living with his servants in the White House to realize that everybody was struggling to a level that he could not possibly imagine. Hoover really lost a lot of support when it came to his response to an incident known as the Bonus Army March. So the Bonus Army were a group of World War I veterans who were seeking an early bonus payment during the Great Depression. They had been promised a bonus for their service in World War I. They were just wanting to receive it a little earlier, considering the conditions that many of them were facing throughout the Great Depression. And President Hoover adamantly refused to allow this to happen. He made it clear that you are not receiving anything early from the federal government. So the Bonus Army responded by showing up at the Capitol and occupying the Capitol. They established a shanty town, which is just a little camp here with makeshift tents made out of sheets, cardboard, whatever they could find. And they called this a Hooverville. Hooverville was a common name for these types of hobo camps or shanty towns throughout the Great Depression. There was this whole kind of set of lingo made to criticize President Hoover's lack of a response to the Great Depression. So, for example, an empty pocket was referred to as a Hoover flag. Coins like nickels and dimes were referred to as Hoover manhole covers. And then these shanty towns, as I said, were called Hoovervilles. All right. So they established this Hooverville there at the Capitol. And President Hoover knew this was going to look really bad for him to have these veterans at the Capitol begging for this bonus payment. So he called in the police to try to send them out. And the police were very hesitant to do much to force these guys out. All right. They kind of said, well, these are veterans of the U.S. Army. They served the country bravely. We kind of don't think they're asking for anything too unreasonable. We're really hesitant to get violent with them and try to kick them out of here. So Hoover said, okay, if I can't count on y'all, I'm going to call in the big guns. As commander in chief, I'm going to call in the Army to deal with the Bonus Army. We called in the U.S. Army, and things got very violent as the Army tried to force the Bonus Army out. Right, there's firsthand accounts of this, racist slurs being hurled back and forth, criticisms between the two groups. But it was very difficult for a lot of these individuals to endure. This has been described as a war between fathers and sons. Okay, you have on one hand older veterans here trying to demand a bonus for their service in World War I. And the people responsible for kicking them out are younger American soldiers. Okay, they're the next generation of soldiers who are very hesitant to really do what they had to do here. But this did get very ugly. Okay, and the Bonus Army was forced out of the Capitol without receiving their early bonus payment. And this is pretty historically significant, I'd say, for a couple of reasons. On one hand, we can see this as a clear example of President Hoover's reluctance to use the federal government's authority to ease the hardships of the Great Depression. Furthermore, as you might imagine, once people started seeing these kinds of pictures and hearing stories about this in newspapers, this led to a rapid decline in support for President Hoover. And by the time Hoover realized that, okay, maybe this thing's a little more out of hand than I thought, maybe just having people turn to local charities and state and local governments isn't a feasible solution, maybe just giving business some money here and there isn't really going to solve the problem. Maybe the federal government does need to take some action. It was a little too late. The Depression had really already hit hard and impacted the majority of citizens in the United States. What he did was not quite enough, all right? So this is just a little too late. So what he really did is he invested in some public works projects, okay? And these were very beneficial to the regions where they were, but they were not really helpful to easing concerns throughout the nation. So, for example, on one very well-known project that he ordered the construction of is what became known as the Hoover Dam, right near the Nevada-Arizona border. And it was very beneficial for people in the region, okay? Created all kinds of jobs, provided various services that called for other types of jobs, all kinds of money going into this thing here, getting money flowing in the economy, helping people out in that way. But what does this do, say, for people up in the Northeast or in Florida or up in Oregon? They're not feeling any of the impacts of this, right? So overall, Hoover's plans weren't very successful. So what we can kind of see is by the early 1930s, Americans were kind of looking for a new avenue to help ease the pressures of the Great Depression. We need to absolutely understand this is a vital moment in American history. Around this time, people in other parts of the world were going through similar situations as a result of the Great Depression. And many of them started clinging to radical ideas and to radical leaders who promised them all kinds of things, most of which turned out to be lies or came at great costs. And the United States at this point, I know we like to think that we're some great nation that's destined to uphold democratic principles and model that for the rest of the world. But at the end of the day, we're just another country of human beings like everyone else. And we very easily at this moment in history here, just like other countries on the world, could have fallen under the regime of some very dangerous radical individuals and taken a completely different path that would have greatly altered the course of not only American history, but world history. So that's where we're leaving off. Leave you on a cliffhanger. Let me know if you got any questions. Otherwise, tune in next lecture. Over and out.